Well, welcome everyone to our 2025 season of the Grow Big Red virtual learning programs. We've got a good lineup. If you haven't seen it, we're going with programs every month, the second Wednesday of the month from noon to 1, all the way through November. So, a lot of stuff scheduled and a lot of great presenters and great programs coming up for you all. So we'll introduce ourselves here. I'm Nicole Stoner. I'm the horticulture educator in Gage County, which is in southeast Nebraska. My office is in Beatrice. Scott,
I'm Scott Evans. I'm horticulture associate in the Omaha office. I help co-lead the Master Gardener program.
perfect. Let's see. John Fish,
Hello, everyone. I'm John Fesh, and I'm a extension educator in the Douglas Sarpy County unit, and looking forward to a great presentation today.
great. Mary Jane,
Mary Jane Froge in Lancaster County, horticulture associate.
Elizabeth,
Hi, everybody. Elizabeth Ekstrom. I'm out of the Hall County Extension Office in Grand Island, and for some reason, my camera just doesn't want to work today.
Sarah,
Hi, everybody. Sarah Browning. I'm with the Lancaster office. Glad you can all join us today.
great. And Dana, we'll let you introduce yourself and then get going.
My name is Dana Freeman, and I am the new Urban Ag and Local Food Systems instructor for the state. I office here in the Douglas Sarpy County's office at 88th and West Center. So thanks for tuning in to Starting a Vegetable Garden. I just wanted to start with some of the benefits of edible gardening. Some of them seem pretty obvious, right? You're saving money by growing some of your own food, albeit you're probably not growing all of your food. And there's a lot of health benefits in that you're eating what you grow. You're increasing your consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables, as well as getting outside in nature and exercising. You're doing good things for the environment. You're reducing the miles from where your food is grown to where it is on your plate. So you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions as well as providing support for pollinators and habitat for insects. And finally, it's just a great hobby. A lot of people enjoy gardening, and it can be quite empowering to grow your own food. Today, I'd like you to at least leave this talk having learned one new thing. And hopefully, our goal here at Extension is to get you to maybe change your practices towards something that's a little bit more sustainable. Today, I'm going to talk about, and I hope you can leave here knowing how to choose the right location, type, and crops for your garden, as well as how to prepare the soil, plant and maintain your vegetable garden. And finally, I want you to know what research-based resources there are for you when you run into a few problems. So I'm going to start a poll. There's 3 easy questions asking about who you are as a gardener. I'm just asking these questions about what describes you as a gardener, what kind of garden types or methods you want to use, as well as your favorite things to grow. It can be just really informative for us to know kind of what you're doing and how we can help. So looking at these results, we're looking at how much experience folks have. And it looks like we've got a lot of folks that are advanced gardeners, even though this class is really geared towards those that are in the beginning. But for the most part, we've got folks that are an intermediate. So that's kind of interesting. How do people like to grow their edibles? It's kind of across the board kind of type with containers, raised beds, or wide rows, and in-ground or conventional rows, which kind of isn't surprising, especially for those of us that might grow in a more urban space, that we kind of use multiple methods depending on the space, depending on what we're trying to accomplish. So one of the good lessons to learn is that you don't need to restrict yourself in terms of the method that you're going to use. And then what do you like to grow? So I put the top 3 answers nationally at the very top, and it kind of aligns where tomatoes are at the very top of the things that people like to grow. Cucumbers and peppers kind of come in second and third. We've got a lot of folks here that are like to garden with herbs, so 59% there. The topics we're going to cover today include site selection, plant selection, preparation, planting, maintenance, and what kind of resources there are that you can use. All right, in terms of site selection, some of the first things we want to think about are those location factors. And we want you to be honest about what kind of sun you've got. Take note of any trees or nearby buildings. And full sun is 6 or more hours of sunlight. Most edibles prefer full sun, especially if you've got something that's going to fruit. You definitely need full sun. Part sun and part shade is when you're getting a little closer to 4 to 6 hours. And you can get by with some leafy greens or herbs. When we start getting into shade, full shade, that's when it's really, really hard to grow edibles. You might get away with a couple things like mint or something that's kind of aggressive and that will grow in shade. Other factors to consider about in your location are soil. How fertile is your soil? How well drained? You need good drainage in a garden. And then if it's relatively level or not. Water is another major factor. You want water to be somewhat nearby. It makes gardening in July a lot easier. So think about where your water source is and just that general convenience factor. I think about, again, the July example. It's really easy to start gardening in April and May. But when we hit the heat of the summer, it's when we really start to have challenges. So think about that when you're locating your garden. There's different garden types. Each has their pros and cons. And in your survey, a lot of you shared that you might use all 3 of these. In-ground gardens are easy in that there's not a lot of cost up front in terms of infrastructure. But one of the challenges is that there's an existing seed bed there that can cause you problems, and that you might have a little more weeds than you do if you're growing in a raised bed or container. Raised beds are nice, especially for those with accessibility issues. It's off the ground a little bit, so it makes it easier to reach for weeding, harvesting, anything that you really need to do in the garden. And it's a really good choice if you've got poor soil quality, and that way you're just raising it above the ground and adding something else in there. Containers are another amazing choice. There's a lot of different materials that you can use as a planter. The benefit in terms of is its portability, to be honest, or if you've got a small space. It's mobile, it can be moved into the sun, but you do become more limited in terms of the crops that you've got. There is a neb guide on container vegetable gardening that we can share if you're interested at extensionhubs.unl.edu. One thing I would like to point out between, say, in-ground gardens and raised beds or wide rows is the more traditional way of growing is to have one row of a vegetable and then a walkway and then another row. And we really advocate for that idea of wider rows. So you're using less walkway and more growing space. So you can do that in terms of making beds in the garden, and they don't have to be raised, but it allows you to plant more intensively. Another factor to consider is your garden size. The thing that I would think about is, what is your time commitment? When do you have time to work in the garden? Is it just after work, or you know, do you have a little bit of time to maybe, you know, do some watering or weeding if it's needed? Also think about, do you have the vacation of your lifetime planned and will you be gone for a month? In general, for beginning gardeners, we say start small, that you can always scale up. And an easy entry point is either a container garden or a 4x8 bed. Some people will say 10x10, but if you're really getting started, the smaller the better. And then just try it when you're starting to grow 3 or 4 things. It just gives you enough to enjoy a small harvest and build your confidence as a gardener. If you are interested in building your garden size, we generally think of per person, 100 square feet will provide enough garden for you to have harvest for fresh eating. If you wanted to do extend that amount of seasonal produce you have with preservation, you would need more like 200 square feet per person. And so I'm always, so when we get folks that call in and say, I want to grow all my own food, I wonder how much time they have and how much space they really do have. The point about the garden size that I would make is to keep it fun. You want your garden to be manageable so that you feel successful and so it's still fun too. So we'll talk a little bit about plant selection. And when you're choosing crops, it might seem obvious, but start with what you like to eat. Don't grow hot peppers if you don't like to eat those. So think about some of the things that you enjoy and what you'd like to eat. And then we've got to think about more about our constraints in terms of where we live in our state and what are our climatic conditions. Our state ranges in hardiness zone from 4B to those of us on the eastern part of the state with 6A. And if you're looking at fruit trees or some of those other perennials, that can make a big difference. You also want to think about your length of your growing season. So that's usually the time between the average last spring freeze and the killing frost in fall. And those ranges in terms of the growing season across Nebraska are from about 135 to 176 days. And that's over a month difference. So if you think about something that takes longer to mature, you might have to be looking for cultivars that are maturing a little bit earlier. So that's something to think about. I put up a couple links here for if you don't know what your hardiness zone is. There's a nice, easy, breezy, put in your zip code and the USDA will tell you. And then I really like the Midwest Regional Climate Center's freeze date tool. And they do have a link or a button you can push to find out the length of your growing season. And so you can click on that, any county across the state, and it will show you what your growing season is. Another thought about choosing the right crop is thinking about the space and that garden size that you did select. There are a lot of new varietals that have been developed for smaller urban spaces or just smaller spaces on patios. A lot of them will say things like bush, dwarf, or patio on them. And here I've got a picture of this cute little tomato that's an All-America Selections winner. I think it's patio choice yellow. And that's about as big as it gets, 18 inches or so. So there's always, if you're looking, you can find something to meet the space that you've got. Next thought about plant selection is thinking about the plant characteristics. I'm not going to harp on seed type, but for those of you that are new, you might see some words and wonder what they are. And then hopefully this will help you make the better choice for you. So you see something that says open pollinated, and that just means that the plants are pollinated naturally, just how they've been since plants came into existence. They are valued because they, sort of maintain genetic diversity, as well as that you're able to save seed from them for the most part, and they're less expensive to buy. So you end up with this wider variety of seeds to choose from. You'll also see things that say that they're heirlooms, which means that they're an open pollinated variety. They just have more provenance or heritage or culture behind them. Some say that it has to be been passed down for at least 50 years to constitute an heirloom. But they're valued particularly for their exceptional flavor and often their interesting color, size, or shape. When you see something that's hybrid or F1, that means that the pollination happened with human intervention. So plant breeding, and why that is of benefit is that you've got these increased desirable traits, whether that's uniformity, yield, longer shelf life for the fruit, and especially disease resistance. You do end up with less choices in the garden center if you're going to buy a transplant, for example. But hybrids can often be very easy choices for beginning gardeners. And then finally, you'll see something that says GMO, or genetically modified organisms. And lots of us have learned what that means. There are a lot of plant seed packets that say non-GMO on them. And if we had been giving this talk this time last year, we would have said there are no GMO seeds available to home gardeners. But that changed last February. So there is one GMO that is available to home gardeners, and it's the purple tomato. And what that means is that the plant was bioengineered to alter its DNA. So it was actually combining tomato DNA with snapdragon to increase bionutrition. And you can save the seed from that, but it's pretty expensive. I think a pack of 10 seeds is $20. But you'll see a lot of other seeds that say non-GMO, and the assumption is that most of the seeds are. Other things to think about in terms of your plant characteristics are thinking about what you might like in terms of the fruit. There's lots of different interesting sizes. You think about your ranges of tomatoes, whether you want, a grape or a beefsteak. You get different shapes, whether you want a typical, eggplant, or do you want something that's longer and skinnier? And there's lots of fruits and vegetables that come in different colors. You can also think about variegated foliage. Sometimes that's really attractive and beneficial. And then we do often want, especially as we're beginners, to think about disease resistance. And then think about those days to maturity, especially when we think about our garden season. So another thing to think about is seasonality and how can you get the most out of Nebraska's growing season. We can grow in the spring, summer, and fall. Those two sort of shoulder seasons, spring and fall, are cool seasons. The plants can either tolerate a light frost, which makes them semi-hardy, or a hard freeze, which then makes them more hardy. But these plants grow best in cool weather. When the temperatures improve or increase, you get more bolting or flowering, and the produce quality declines. There are certain cool season crops that taste better with exposure to freeze and cold. For example, kale and Brussels sprouts, just have a higher quality when they've been exposed to freezing temperatures. And conversely, you think of something like radishes. When they've been exposed to warmer temperatures, they get more fibrous and kind of unpleasant. So our cool season crops are those, if you want to generalize, are rooting crops, the crops we eat the stems of, the leaves, and the immature flowers. Immature flowers being like broccoli, cauliflower, leaves being like our leafy greens. Stems could be asparagus, and roots are, carrots, turnips, etc. Our warm season crops, conversely, are those that are not frost tolerant, right? So that's the summertime, after danger of frost has passed, and they grow best in that warmer weather. These are our fruiting crops, or immature fruits. So whether those are beans, green beans, squashes, melons, tomatoes, those are different plants to think about. And you can get more out of your garden if you think about planting something from the cool season, and then once succession planting in the summer, and then again in the fall. Another thing in terms of plant selection can be thinking about your skill level. You can as a beginner, you can choose crops that are easy to grow. You might consider hybrids for things like tomatoes and peppers. It makes your job a lot easier. And as beginners, sometimes I would think about determinate tomatoes. Determinate tomatoes have a shorter fruit production. What's nice is that they grow to a certain height and stop growing. So there's a lot less maintenance. Some might not even need much staking. And those tend to be a lot of them you can think of as like bush early girl, bush celebrity, bush steak. The plant tags will have often, we'll say DET for determinate, but that's just something to think about as a beginning gardener. But there's herbs that you can think about growing, like basil and dill. Lettuce and radishes are easier in the cool season. And then for warm season crops, you can think about green beans, peppers, tomatoes, and of course, zucchini. Have a lot to give. There's a lot of resources in terms of how to choose plants. Iowa State has a great guide here about selecting vegetable varieties. You can also look at All America Selections, and that's a nonprofit trialing organization. And here in Douglas, Sarpy counties, we participate in trialing some of these new varieties that breeders are trying to introduce into the market. And then if you like to look at the Backyard Farmer Display Garden, they display those selected All-America selections. So that's a good resource. Another one that I like is vegetable varieties for gardeners from Cornell University. And why that's pretty nice is that it's a citizen science project where folks just like you can provide feedback on different varieties. So thinking about preparing your garden, and if it's an in-ground garden, ideally you would start preparations the season before. That way that you can begin gardening when the soil is workable. Workable means that the ground isn't frozen and it's not too wet. You want the soil to be friable, or that means kind of crumbly when you pick it up. If you're in the garden and the soil is stuck to your boots or shoes, and they're clunky and heavy, that's too wet. At the beginning of starting an in-ground garden requires removing existing vegetation. And that can be done in several ways, whether you're, if it's grass, you could use a sod cutter if you're cutting a large area. Or if you're doing a smaller garden, you can just use a spade and take off that top layer of turf. So digging is definitely an option. I listed these options here kind of in how fast they work. You can use an herbicide option to kind of get rid of the vegetation. You have to look at the product that you're using and wait the requisite number of days before before that you would be able to plant. There's heavy mulching where you can put up 8 to 12 inches of mulch down, and in a few weeks that should kill whatever is beneath. The disadvantage of probably doing that is that you can get, say, chip drop or someone to give you those that mulch, but then you don't want that mulch in your vegetable garden necessarily, so you'd have to kind of pull it back. And then there's options of smothering, and whether that's with plastic or newspapers or what have you, but that can often take a couple of months. So you could also try to get your garden ready this spring in preparation for gardening in the summer, and that's a fine idea. So just think about that. And once you've gotten rid of that existing vegetation on top, we want to refrain from tilling. Tilling is detrimental to our soil structure, and we want to refrain from doing that as much as possible. Most of our soils across the state of Nebraska will benefit from the addition of a couple inches of compost. And you can just put down a couple inches of compost, and then using a spade, like in the image here, just turn that over to a depth of 10 to 12 inches should be sufficient for anything that you're growing. And just kind of incorporating that. You don't need to kind of beat the soil to death, but just get it turned over, and you can kind of rake and smooth it out. One important thing in an in-ground garden is soil testing. We generally want to test our soils before we're adding a ton of amendments. And here I put a QR code to, it's on our HLES website. It has soil and water testing labs for Nebraska. It's an article Sarah Browning put on our website. But we want you to test your soil before getting started gardening. And then you can, once you get your soil test report, you can bring it into the extension office. We'd be happy to help you. And then you want to continue testing your soil every 3 to 5 years. Getting raised beds and containers can be a little bit easier. Raised beds, you just need a structure, whatever that is. And I put a link here from Penn State. They have an easy guide for a smaller raised bed design for urban growers, if that's something that's of interest to you. And raised beds, we want to use, using the term enriched topsoil. So that usually means using not just say straight from the ground topsoil, but topsoil mixed with compost is usually what you want to put in there. You want something that drains well, and compost helps do that. So you can kind of see in this picture, you end up with something that's pretty black and rich. If you can usually call your nurseries or wherever you get your garden supplies, and often they will have a raised bed mix. And that's usually the mix of topsoil and compost. If you go to the garden center and buy bags of topsoil is not regulated in the US, so you don't know exactly what it is, but you can improve your raised bed by adding compost. And containers, when we're preparing those before we plant, no matter what container you use, it has to have drain holes. It has to have drain holes. If it doesn't, you can buy some of those inexpensive diamond drill bits that'll fit on any drill and put holes in it, 4-inch holes. Depending on the size of the container, you may need multiples. But our containers we fill with soilless potting mix. You don't want anything heavier because you really need good drainage in your containers. So these are a couple of tips in terms of preparing different garden types. Something else to think about, especially for new gardeners, is what kind of investment do you need in tools? And I would say if you only bought one tool, it would be a hori-hori knife, or some people call it a soil knife. It is useful for, you can use it in place of a trowel. And this one you see here has planting depths on it. But it's also excellent as a weeder. The other things that you really need are, some way to water, whether that's hose or a watering can. And in general, pruners can be pretty helpful. And that can be with harvesting, especially. The bottom tools that I mentioned here that are in italics are if you are gardening in ground, then you are going to probably need some of the long-handled tools. And that would be at the most basic level, a spade, probably a rake, and a hoe or some type of weeder. You can always consider your preference for gloves. And usually folks have a trug or a bucket that you can put things in, whether that's throw your tools in them, throw your weeds in them to take to the compost pile. And something else that's usually pretty helpful is a soil thermometer. So you don't have to go out and buy a ton of fancy tools. If you're container gardening, you can get by with a trowel. Or even raised bed gardening. The hori-hori knife can keep it pretty inexpensive. When we think about our plant materials, you have to make the decision about whether you're going to use seeds or seedlings. And when we use seeds, that means that we're going to directly sow them into the garden. Or if we're using seedlings, that means that we're going to transplant them as small plants in the garden. Benefits to direct sowing is that it's usually a little more cost effective. You can get a wider variety of choices than you might at the garden center where they've got transplants. The downside is it can take longer to grow. With your seedlings, again, kind of flips. They're faster to grow or mature. But the upside for transplants can be, especially for beginners, that it's a little bit easier to do. Things that we plant as seedlings, I've made a list kind of here, and a lot of those are either some of the larger pole crops that take a little bit longer to mature, or are our warm season crops. So these are things that you can think about purchasing as seedlings. A couple of these you can go either way. I put a little asterisk by kale or chard. Some people buy it as transplants. It's fairly easy to direct seed. If you'll notice, broccoli or Brussels sprouts aren't on this list. We would use seedlings for Brussels sprouts, but in Nebraska, we generally recommend that Brussels sprouts are planted as a fall crop. And regardless of even if you buy these plants at the store, you want to think about hardening them off or acclimating to outside. If I go to my local nursery and these plants are coming out of a greenhouse, they may not know what it's like to be outside in the evening. So you want to take a period of time where you're setting them outside in a shadier, protected environment and kind of increase their exposure over a couple of weeks. So planting, about planting timing is one of the most important things. And people often want us to give them dates about when to plant. But as we know, weather changes. So what we do is we play a numbers game. And in the spring, that numbers game has to do with our last spring freeze. And these dates that you get from meteorologists will change depending on the data set that they're using and over what period it is. So some use a 30 or 100-year period, or different organizations use different data sets. So what I've popped up here is from the National Weather Service. You can go to your local site. Obviously, not every county has that, But it's basically www.weather.gov, and you can put in your zip code and look for the last spring freeze. And the date that they give here is the average. So this is the average last spring freeze, or when the temperatures were 32 degrees. And so here I can look and see, say around Omaha, it's April 21. But is that the time that I want to go out and plant watermelon? Probably not, because that average means that's a 50th percentile. That means that 50% of the spring freezes happened before, but 50% happened afterwards. And so it's a pretty risky endeavor. Again, I mentioned the Midwest Regional Climate Center. They have similar data. The data set's a little different, and but you can get more information for any county in Nebraska, and they do a better job of having where you can manipulate the data. So in that lower left corner, you can, and it doesn't exactly look like this on the site, but you can do this for the last spring freeze or the first fall freeze. You can choose the temperature. You can choose 32. You can go lower with 28 or higher with 36. And then you choose the statistic. And so the statistic is what is important. The previous slide, we looked at the 50th percentile, which we would kind of consider a medium risk. High risk would be if you chose the 10th percentile, meaning that 90% of the frosts happen after that. But what as gardeners, we really like to look at is the later spring freeze or the 90th percentile. We generally use that as our sort of last spring freeze and use that sort of as a plant out date, especially for our warmer season crops, because that means that only 10% of spring freezes happen after that date. And when we're handling plants, that's a better choice. So the last spring freezes varies across our state. Down in Richardson County in the southeast, that last spring freeze is May 1. Or if you're in Sioux County in the Northwest Panhandle, that might be May 25th. So this is a very important date, and you can find it out by looking at the freeze data tool and then clicking on your county, and it'll show you the 10, 50, and 90th percentiles. So we kind of talked about that, about the sort of those early, average, and late percentiles. And we use the later one as sort of our warm season plant out date. The average is often when we think of planting our semi-hardy cool crops, or those that say 2 weeks before the last freeze. And then the early number is for those hardier cool season crops, when we're planting, when it says 4 weeks before that last frost. So in Omaha, where I'm at, those numbers look like the early would be April 8th when you're thinking about planting out broccoli transplants. April 20th is when you might plant that average date for cauliflower. And then the late or 90th percentile is that first week in May, May 2nd. Again, different data sets will say the 3rd or the 4th, but those are the dates that we're kind of looking at. And this enables us to have a little bit of a lower risk in terms of choosing when we're kind of planning and having sort of an estimate of what we're going to do. There are a lot of garden calculators out there that once you find that final spring frost or that 90th percentiles last spring freeze, you can go to these websites, put in that date, and it will give you a range of data about when to start seeds indoors or when to sow seeds outdoors or transplant. And again, none of these are necessarily university-based, but they're pretty decent in terms of just having sort of an estimation of what you might want to do. This top one is by Margaret Roach, and she's the garden columnist in the New York Times. That's how I know who she is. But some of your seed companies, Urban Farmer Seeds, Johnny's has a calculator, as well as the National Gardening Association. So these can be helpful for those of us that live across the state, where we've got this wide variety of last spring freezes. And it gives us kind of an idea about when we want to put things in the ground. Even though we do have those dates, we want to think about soil temperature. And you can use an inexpensive soil thermometer. It's this one in the picture doesn't have, this one just looks like something you would use in the, it does say soil thermometer on it, but it might use like something you put in a turkey leg. Some of them, like the one I have, has, when you get to the temperature, it'll give an example of what you can plant at those temperatures. But you want to put the soil thermometer into the ground at 4 inches and do that consistently. Do it in the same place, at the same time over a period of, a few days to try to get a sense of what your soil temperatures are. Containers or raised beds will always be warmer because they've got those outside air temperatures. And if you don't have a soil thermometer, you can look at Crop Watch, and I put the website here where you can find, they've got the daily soil temperatures and then the sort of weekly average. We're still around, most of us in the west of the part of the state, you might be in the high 20s, and then those of us in the east are in the low 30s. So it's still pretty chilly. I'd also just point out on the Midwest Regional Climate Center, they've got an interesting little soil climatology tool that you can put averages for when soil warms at 4 inches, warms above X date, and it'll give you the 10, 50th, and 90th percentile of those dates. So it's just another interesting and fun tool. We can get kind of an estimate and play with some data. This is a guide made by our former colleague about when to seed or transplant, and using soil temperatures and thinking about some of the crops that we might use or plant, whether that's transplants or seeds at those soil temperatures. And if we look at that last frost or that middle line, usually our soil temperatures around that last, that 90th percentile last spring freeze, we're creeping towards those 60-degree temperatures. That 2 weeks before tends to be the 50-degree temperatures, and the 4 weeks before that date is usually the 40-degree temperatures. Those are approximations. Again, you would want to monitor that. And when you're looking for ideal or optimum germination temperatures, I put a NEP guide here where you can find that information. And then the planting method. If you've decided to use seeds, the best information is going to be on your seed packet. Follow the planting and spacing up there. And then when you water gently. And then you want to keep the soil consistently moist. So consistent, moist soil is very important during that germination and seedling establishment. It's critical. Moist means not too wet, not too dry. And just think about the sort of fragility of those seedlings and how they can be affected by, wind or air temperature. And once you get going, you may need to thin plants. And as you can see on the seed packet to the left, there's recommendations for that. Don't be scared. Thinning is important. And when you're planting seeds, another option for increasing your productivity is relay planting, which is just staggering the sowing of seeds at regular intervals so that your harvest doesn't all come at once. So you get to have sort of a continuous harvest. And I put a guide here for understanding the seed packet. And then seedlings, when we plant seedlings, we choose, after they've hardened off, a cloudy day or a late afternoon to try to transplant, just to give them a little protection before they are facing the blazing sun. You dig a hole slightly larger than the root ball. Gently put the plant in the hole and cover it with soil. We don't grab plants by their stems. If we have to touch the plant, we touch by the leaves. Plants only have one stem. If you break the stem, that means you're usually pretty done for. Plants can stand to lose a leaf or two. And most of your transplants that you purchase will have a tag that mentions any spacing requirements. And then we want to water these thoroughly. And for seedlings especially, install any cages or trellises that you want. If you let the tomato or pepper or whatever you're growing get going too long before putting that hardware in, it's kind of tricky. And then depending on where you live, you might have to think about fencing. And that's something you can ask your extension educator about. Maintenance, the most important thing probably is watering. We don't want to overwater, but we also don't want to underwater. And the DIY moisture sensor is your finger up to the second knuckle. And you'll know because if you pull that finger out and it's mud, mud is stuck to it, well, then that's too moist. Or if it's completely dry, then that's too dry. It's kind of like sticking a toothpick in a cake. You want it to be moist, not too dry, not too wet. And then after we've got our seedlings or transplants established, we want to start doing more deeper and infrequent watering. And what that does is that allows a deeper root growth. We water earlier in the mornings and we water roots. We don't water plant leaves. Early morning watering minimizes evaporation. And we minimize diseases by watering roots, not leaves. You can consider soaker hoses as well as mulches to maintain consistent soil moisture. Fertilizing is done based on a soil test and the needs of your plant. In ground and raised beds, you might use a water soluble product at transplant and then switch to a more slower release granular product. And with containers, it depends on if there was fertilizer in that potting mix. And if there is, it usually will say fertilizer lasts, 4 to 6 weeks or whatever the answer is. And then you switch to water, the more water soluble mix during the mid-season. But it's important to purchase fertilizers based on what you're growing. So it should be labeled for vegetables, for example. And we always follow label directions every time we fertilize. Weeding is something that people kind of dread. I kind of get a flow in terms of when I start weeding. Weed management begins with weed ID. So knowing what is a weed before you pull it out. And staying on top of weeding, it makes it a lot easier. So you can hand weed or hoe and do that regularly. And again, mulch serves a purpose in that it suppresses weed growth. So you can use untreated grass clippings, weed-free straw, shredded leaves, or newspaper. So these organic or biodegradable products. And if you, the best book for weed ID in Nebraska is Weeds of the Great Plains, but you can also find some resources online or ask your folks at Extension. We want to keep an eye on our plants and monitor for pests and diseases. Again, we want to catch things early, and then we need to know what we're dealing with before we recommend any sort of treatment or management. So, check for early signs. If you're seeing dead or diseased tissues, you can remove those, prune them out. And you might even need to prune out, say if it's tomato, for example, you might need to remove some foliage to get good air circulation. But you can, again, use your resources, your local resources, your local extension staff to help you identify what's going on. The same with pests. A lot of our pests can be handpicked or just washed off with a strong stream of water. In the picture here, you'll see a tomato hornworm, and those can just be picked and removed, probably unless you're Jody can remove those tomatoes for this. Harvesting, you want to just pick your produce at peak maturity. There's a guide at the bottom when to harvest fruits and vegetables. I think Sarah Browning wrote that. And you want to harvest regularly to encourage further production. That's especially important for things like beans. And if you're doing herb gardening, try to deadhead the herbs. Otherwise, I mean, the flowers can be very pretty, but if you're using the herbs culinarily, you want the leaves to maintain their flavor and encourage the growth. So regular deadheading of herbs is important. And then the end of the season, good fall cleanup is one of the most important things we can do in terms of preventing disease problems in the future. So you remove all of the plant materials after the freeze. And in this example picture is a home compost pile. That's not where we want to usually put our plant materials. Unless you're reaching 140 degrees there, that's not likely. So only compost if it's going to like an industrial compost facility in Lincoln or Omaha, for example. Your container garden media, usually, you can kind of toss those flowers and do the industrial compost, but that soil you can put out in the garden. A couple other things to do are to think about where vegetables were grown. Kind of make a little map if you haven't already, because that can inform crop rotation next year. And to sort of finish, gardening is a process, right? It's we're always learning and growing, and you've got to kill a few plants sometimes to learn. So don't be discouraged. Finally, some resources. You can find your area extension experts and master gardeners on the HLES website. There's a lot of good resources also on Backyard Farmer, and you can watch the show when it gets going. I would recommend you use the internet wisely and try to add to your search string site:/edu, and don't be afraid to stop and investigate sources. You don't want to just read and believe everything on the internet. Finally, up next in the GroBigRed virtual learning series, next month is Kelly Behan, rain gardens, where to use them, what to plant in them. Please fill out the survey.
Yes, that would be great. If you guys could do that QR code and fill out the survey, even if you're watching this on the recording.
Yeah, and thanks for joining us on Snow Day.